Someone should be sampling this audio. Make a great song intro.
I've got plenty of examples of it. All right, so if I do that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now.
Yeah, I'll be all right. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, that's a little bit confusing in that I'm staring at myself from 10 seconds ago on YouTube Live, because there's a delay. Okay, so do I need to do anything? I'm not gonna. Yes, I am gonna start recording the so I don't forget. Okay, so I'm now recording. So welcome to everybody. This is the, where are we? The 7th session on geographies of popular music and transculturalism, and we've got a slightly different format this week from usual. Britta Sweers, who's the keynote, will be doing her presentation via video. Well, I've got the video of her presentation for Mapping London Through Song, Geographies of Popular Music and Transculturalism, and after her presentation, Britta is going to respond to questions through the comments section throughout the week. So I have finally managed to work out how to make WordPress send an email when someone makes a comment. For some reason, although it says it's really easy and automatic, it wasn't easy or automatic, and I've now, I think, worked it out. So if you have any questions for Britta, the comment section on the website, rather than the chat here on the Zoom section, is the place to do it, and she'll reply, and you should get an email back saying that she's replied, so that you can carry on the discussion. So after the video presentation, we've got a panel on the value of diversity in the curriculum with Mike Allain, who's here. Well, for me, he's there. And I'm not going to try and point at people now because they're not in the same places as they are on everybody else's screen. But Mike Allain from Mid-Tennessee State University, and Luis Ricardo Silva Queiroz, from the Universidade Federal de Paraíba, and Laudan Nushin from City University of London. And that's going to be the second thing that we do today, and then there's a short 20-minute concert by Sandra Vaseli, which will be streamed through the Zoom session and then available online. The other two things I need to announce: on Thursday, Casper, one other thing is that at 9:30 10 new papers come online as well. So we've got 10 papers. You can see what they are on the website now, but they become available at 9:30 UK time this evening. Then on Thursday at 6 p.m. UK time, Casper Melville is running a session called Race, Space and Bass, the Past and Future of London's Sonic Spaces, which is in part a launch for his It's a London Thing book, but it's also a discussion about race, space and bass. And that's with Emma Warren and Jesse Bernard. And then on Friday, Alex DeLacy will be running his regular Friday afternoon spot. I'm really sorry that I forgot to send out the Zoom invite on Friday. I was on leave and I sat with Joseph Conrad, reading Joseph Conrad all day on Friday, and completely forgot about the fact that I was running this conference. So apologies for not sending that Zoom invite out, but Alex now has the power to send them himself, so that should be the last time that problem happens. Okay, so that's everything, I think. So what I'm going to do now is share the screen and play Britta's keynote presentation. So if everybody could switch off their cameras and microphones, well, microphones in particular, but okay. Okay, and great. Okay, so here we go.
Welcome everyone to my presentation on Mapping London Through Song, Geographies of Popular Music and Transculturalism.
May I ask you your name? Lord Kitchener. Lord Kitchener. Now I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes, that's
Well, now,
so
will you
true.
sing for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London.
On June 22, 1948, calypsonian Lord Kitchener, Alton Roberts, sang "London is the place for me" to news reporters after having just embarked the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks. Kitchener not only outlined his global political map of London as the mother country here, but also provided a glimpse into his inner London geography, a comfortable place where you can live as a millionaire and enjoy the breeze and encounter sociable citizens. Wishful thinking, of course, but exactly by contrasting reality, the song reveals this predominant global perception of a wide European London, combined with the ideal of living in Hampton Court rather than, as many migrants would, for instance, in the East. And also Kitchener would soon, similar to other calypsonians, address the racism experienced in London. Recorded in 1951, the song is a significant marker of the expansion of musical variety and multicultural identity in London at that time. But which music is actually included or excluded in contemporary music maps? And what kind of cultural maps are actually represented in popular London-related songs? This presentation provides glimpses into the transforming musical mapping of London from a transcultural perspective. The iconic London, that might be described almost as a global brand, clearly contrasts the network of communities so varied and complex as London. Given that I could not undertake any fieldwork, I will rather start from a macro perspective by reflecting on the concept of transculturality, hereby asking what happens when a location becomes a global icon, but also asking what or who becomes actually visible in this global context. By likewise discussing the approach of cultural mapping, I would like to illustrate that, while music often also challenges existing power hierarchies, how little of some underlying structures and perception mechanisms actually change. If there is a location that has been marked by and mapped in songs, it is London. London guides such as Time Out regularly publish lists with the 100 best songs of London, and this is just the peak of a much larger iceberg. As you can see here, one could just literally walk musically through London that forms a maze of hundreds of stories, networks, relations, told and conveyed through popular music song and listed in related magazines. Yet, what exactly is reflected by these songs from a transcultural perspective? Which London is mapped here? What kind of geography is reflected through these songs? Let me just elaborate some theoretical issues related to the keywords of geography, transculturalism, and cultural mapping. As is the case with many keywords from the area of cultural studies, the expression of transculturalism gets increasingly contradictory with deeper reflection. Derived from the Latin terms trans, over, beyond, and cultus, cultivated, transculturalism describes phenomena of cultural transgression that might also lead to the dissolution of established borders, evident in key phrases such as extending through all human cultures. As Langenol and al. Pointed out, the suffix culturalism usually points to more than one culture, which is also interrelated with the question of what is actually culture? Well, we all know this question. Yet in most transcultural debates, this has been modified to what happens when two cultures encounter. This question is hereby clearly interrelated with the pluralization process because, until then, culture had mostly been dealt with in singular form. The concept was initially developed in Latin American studies. It was actually first articulated by the Cuban scholar, lawyer, and politician Fernando Ortiz Fernandez, by the way, also one of the founders of Cuban ethnomusicology, and a good example of a distorted academic map. Despite his major works, Ortiz is little known outside the Spanish-speaking world. Ortiz, who focused on Afro-Cuban cultures, described transculturalism as a double-edged fusion process in which something new emerges, but in which also elements get destroyed. This conceptualization was actually intertwined with a critical rethinking of the then central concept of acculturation. From Ortiz's perspective, acculturation was too ethnocentric, one-sided towards the positive, and overloaded with colonial imbalances. Yet it took some decades until a more comprehensive discourse emerged, as, for example, being represented in the writings of philosopher Wolfgang Welch, in Transculturality, the Changing Form of Cultures Today from 2001. As Welch argues, the concept of transculturality suggests a new conceptualization of culture differing from classical monocultures and the more recent conceptions of interculturality and multiculturality. The traditional description of cultures as islands or spheres is wrong, because cultures today are characterized internally by a pluralization of identities and externally by border-crossing contours. Furthermore, this traditional concept, which emphasizes homogeneity and delineation, is normatively dangerous and structurally suppressing differences and encouraging separatism and violent conflicts. The concepts of interculturality and multiculturalism tackle some of these ills, but their basic flaws remains the presupposition of cultures as homogeneous islands or enclosed spheres, such as, for instance, the Turks, the Chinese, etc. The current situation of thick globalization, however, requires a different, much more open and fluid concept. The latter is also evident with subsequent authors who elaborated further aspects, such as ideas of a new humanism and spatial concepts, as with Lamberto Tassarini, shared cross-cultural and national interests in what is described as a transcultural era, as with Richard Slimbach, and an awareness of the difficulties and unevenness of the process and related politics, as evident with Jeff Lewis. The concept remains difficult to grasp. Interestingly, it is not mentioned at all in quite a few major introductions to cultural studies, as for instance those listed here. And this also points to one of the problems of cultural theory anthologies in general, the need for a very quick and constant updating of the material. This complex handling of the term is also reflected in ethnomusicology, which I take as my main perspective here. Among the few publications sticking more closely to the original debates is Max Peter Baumann's The Charango as Transcultural Icon of Andean Music. Very much in context with the preceding Latin American discourses, Baumann addresses the specific South American colonial context, and he also utilized the related terminology in order to describe the different processes of encounters of two or more different cultures. In his well-outlined model, transculturation, if you take a look at the lower parts of this model, is used to mark the only actual fusion process. The concept is handy in that it can also be transferred to genre-related encounter and fusion processes, such as the likewise London-based electric folk scene, which was my original PhD research topic. For example, the English folk revival emerged against the background of a strong deculturation, that is, the complete embracing of the foreign or dominant culture, here Anglo-American popular music, which stimulated revivalists like Ewan MacColl to set up very restrictive folk club rules in order to revive so-called authentic music from the British Isles. In a way, the London-based hardcore clubs hereby switched to a, however artificial, form of reculturation by rejecting outside influences. The third option, transculturation, however, occurred outside the folk clubs, and it was especially London that provided the ideal ground for experimental folk rock, jazz, and so on fusions towards new forms. Borman subdivides this process into compartmentalization, syncretism, and transformation towards new forms. In the case of electric folk, fusions merge towards the form of syncretism. The instruments are still audible as folk versus rock instruments. It was so not just yet a true transformation, as in the case, for instance, of South American musics, where the original components merge towards a completely new forms. This not only applies to forms like tango or samba, but also to Lord Kitchener's Calypso song as a fusion of West African and French and English rhythmic and musical elements, as well as a linguistic fusion towards a new recognizable form. I personally find this model still extremely useful for the description of the actual musical fusion processes. Quite strikingly, transculturalism does not even have an entry in ethnomusicology's most recent encyclopedia, the Sage International Encyclopedia of Music and Culture, maybe also because of being more strongly related to processes on the popular music level. I am very careful to make too many generalizations, and I'm also mainly focusing on the ethnomusicological perspective here. But despite having become a central keyword in recent years, there's a tendency towards relating the term to the non-specific, as is also evident with Wong's article on Gangnam Style. Here, transculturalism in music is defined as, and I quote, a result of the growing transnational corporations and global marketing network in music industry. Transculturalism involves the merging of different elements from different kinds of music taking place in an industrial environment. Transcultural music is therefore an industrial product without any roots in any specific ethnic group. Quote end. And this is combined with a search for a common language that is mutually understood, also in the case of the Gangnam video. Yet mostly the term has been discussed with regard to world music, while particularly in the German-speaking context, it has been strongly used with regard to inter- and transcultural school music education. However, in many cases, it appears that as a freely handled term, but is not really thoroughly applied in relation to the original discourses. So with regard to this talk here, this means that I'm mainly understanding or using transculturalism. For me, it denotes a heterogeneous perception of cultures and of related modern global interaction processes. By moving to the UK, also Lord Kitchener's Calypso shifted into the Western global networks and contexts, hereby becoming part of further transcultural encounters. I started out with this song also because it is prominently listed on the many London-related song lists, such the 100 Best London Songs of Time Out, songs about London, 35 of the Best, by Musical Express, the website, London That Nobody Sings, Spotify lists, and so on. Yet, while these lists include popular tunes such as London Calling, Streets of London, or Warwick Avenue, clearly aimed at a global touristy and branded representation of London, the actual sociocultural musical map behind these lists only becomes apparent with further analysis. In order to bring out related hidden geographies, the method of cultural mapping seems to be useful here. An approach that has been highlighted by UNESCO as a central methodological resource for safeguarding cultural diversity. And I quote here, "Cultural mapping has been recognized by UNESCO as a crucial tool and technique in preserving the world's intangible and tangible cultural assets. It encompasses a wide range of techniques and activities, from community-based participatory data collection and management to sophisticated mapping using geographic information systems." Roughly defined as a representation usually on a flat surface or of the whole or a part of an area, maps are always symbolic abstractions of reality, as is evident with all topographic or geographical maps that represent the three-dimensional global surface in 2 dimensions. This abstraction is also apparent on other levels. While seemingly conveying authentic representations, maps need to minimize, reduce, or generalize complex systems and structures. They also need to be complete, precise, and understandable with regard to symbols, colors, aesthetics, which remains a challenge for cartographers until present day. Yet we might also ask, who decides actually how the map is being drawn? The most fundamental goal of cultural mapping is to help communities to recognize, celebrate, and support cultural diversity for economic, social, and regional development. Further specified by Kroll and Rimbaldi, and I quote again, "Cultural mapping is a way of defining what culture means to community, identifying the elements of culture that add value, both social and economic, recording, preserving, or building on these elements in new and creative ways." In contrast to conventional maps, cultural mapping also represents other cultural resources and information recorded by alternative technique, including the simultaneous usage of multiple forms of documentation and maps. However, despite the general idea of simply marking the presence of usually invisible cultures and cultural spots, UNESCO remained extremely vague about the actual application. In order to detect blind spots, I will actually reverse the perspective by charting the representation of London through these songs. Now, returning to the London song lists, we can notice that at first sight, London has been clearly marked and mapped in an almost classical 2-dimensional way through song. Many locations have been related to and marked by internationally successful popular songs. They reveal, similar to Lord Kitchener's Calypso, the global transcultural value of the city, to the extent that one could actually travel the tube through songs, tunes, and hooks or riffs without ever having been there. If we just think of Jerry Rafferty's Baker Street, Donovan's Sunny Good Street, Sachs' Camden Town, or Duffy's romantic Warwick Avenue, each of these songs connects a tune or a specific hook, such as the famous saxophone solo of Baker Street, with a location, which I would describe as a form of 2-dimensional mapping. And I just can't resist to play the Baker Street saxophone solo here. Now, this rich sounding map nevertheless deviates from actual sound maps, such as the London Sound Survey, as they reflect not reality, but a kind of cultural, fictional, emotional map. This partly even includes real sounds like the famous Mind the Gap that is almost a brand in itself now. This surface mapping likewise occurs on a historical level. There are lots of songs relating to historical locations such as the Tower of London. In fact, each of these songs might also be described as a transcultural marker or icon of London, here in the sense that it is also perceived beyond the local national cultural context. Yet there are other musical tube maps. While, for instance, Lord Kitchener actually loses his way in the station of the Underground train, the jams down at the tube station at midnight from 1978 provides a rather chilly impression of a narrator who is attacked in the tube, which was a dangerous place at that time.
To take them home to the ones that they love and who love them forever. Replace 30 steps, repeat my own and reflect my thoughts. Cold and uninviting, partially naked.
How far are the previous songs that represent a classical two-dimensional sound map actually truly global and transnational, or rather part of a Western global network? And what about the global understanding of the song's actual content? I just thought that Baker Street is actually an excellent example of a locally related song's transformation towards a transculturally recognizable icon. None of the contemporary reviews, such as by Rolling Stone, actually dealt with the street or the song itself. Rather, all focus on the saxophone solo by which Baker Street became a transculturally recognizable icon. Within a three-dimensional perspective that includes content and context, the song reveals a socio-critical perception of London. As a Guardian review pointed out, since its release, it has been a mainstay of drive time playlists, but how many of the jocks who played it so relentlessly over the years have really listened to the lyrics which speak of booze, depression, promiscuous sex, and people with no soul? And how many could have known that the seemingly innocuous reference to a new dawning alluded to Jerry Rafferty's struggle to extricate himself from his Steelers Wheel record contract and his own battle with alcoholism? Rolf McTale's Streets of London adds a further aspect to this transcultural iconization of local songs. As McTale pointed out, he initially wanted to call the song that deals with the situation of the homeless Streets of Paris. Is it thus the non-specific, exchangeable, local that can be transferred and understood transculturally? Because this seems to be the case, and exactly the reason why the song still works today. It can be transferred to other situations, even Corona, and Ralph McTell just adapted the song to the current situation. This transferability is also evident with this conference's main title, The Clash, London Calling. With its title, the British punk band made a reference to the BBC World Service, which might be described as a transcultural memory. Strummer had encountered the program in Malawi. And subsequent artists would continue relating to this transferable title, not necessarily the content, on a transcultural level. And I have Falco's Vienna Calling in mind here. Originally called Ice Age, the original song refers to a period of high unemployment and social unrest that led to the London Brixton Uprising in 1981. Depicting a kind of final scenario shaped by nuclear disaster inspired by 3 Mile Island and environmental disaster, the drowning of actually London as a kind of symbol, the song's SOS code relates to another globally understood yet Western-based code. And I just would like to play this ending here.
Calling, yes, I was there too. And you know what they said? Well, some of it was true. London calling at the top of the dial. And after all this, won't you give me a smile?
Yet, cultural maps shift and transform over time. This can be exemplified by a large range of London-related historical songs that provide snapshots of historical London maps. Driving North, for instance, Fair Maid of Islington always pops on my personal map. The folk song about a young woman going to London to sell fruits and outwitting a man who wants to have sex with her. We still encounter a different topography of Islington and London that still represents separate units here. This transformation likewise applies to older popular songs, such as Petula Clark's Meet Me at Battersea Park, and just a brief snippet here.
If you're a Londoner just like me, meet me in Battersea Park. If you are young or you'd like to be.
So meeting at Battersea Park is not possible anymore because the Funfair Park was closed in the 1970s. Rather, the location has shifted from, say, romanticism towards industrial nostalgia. Battersea is usually globally associated with Pink Floyd's Animals' Battersea Power Plant Station cover of 1977. Yet, how strongly local historical icons can become subject of shifting transcultural references in music is best illustrated with London Bridge. London Bridge is already a recurring referential point in the traditions, as evident with songs like Geordie or the ditty London Bridge is Falling Down, which also contributed to the iconization of the location. Already, the original ditty contains a large bulk of historical references, be it with regard to the unverified reference to the Viking attacks or to the medieval architecture, when the bridge actually also hosted a row of houses on both sides.
London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
In 1978, the bridge became a new referential point of a different map when the Jamaican roots reggae band Culture sampled the ditty in their song Bolted Bridge. Coded in Rastafari language, Bolted stands for the oppressive system, which was already addressed in Bob Marley's Crazy Bald Heads. The most well-known song in this context is probably Nutriment's London Bridge is Falling Down from 1983. The band's name already being an association to a milky drink popular with Afro-Caribbean communities. Also, the song was a transformed shift away from the two-dimensional London song markers. This early hip-hop example now includes London's marginal voices as well, by criticizing electoral politics, malpractice, and inner-city decay.
This is a cool jam, this is a cool jam, and I'm coming to give you Superman.
Yet, how locations end up on Western global cultural maps is best illustrated by Fergie's London Bridge. Representing an American perspective, the song's location became a sexual symbol, the falling here pointing to, and I quote, falling for a guy down into his arms, quote, end. While the album's title Duchess exclusively relates to white imagery, here's Sarah Ferguson. It was thus read, especially from the outside, such as in German reviews, who perceived it as a nice club song, not geographically or sociopolitically, but plainly musically. The lack of real geographic imagery is also evident in that the video displays the Tower Bridge, not London Bridge.
Give me love you long time. All my girls get down on the floor. Back to back, drop it down real low. I'm such a lady, but I'm dancing like a. Cause you know what, I don't give up. So here we go. How come every time you come around my London Bridge?
If we map the 100 London songs contexts, it becomes apparent that, with a few exceptions, the lists mostly contain the British-wide, historical, iconic imagery of English and/or transcultural London. London is a place of the white community on these sound maps, and the transcultural represents a mainly white Western experience. These maps dominate the mainstream. There are only a few reggae songs, no Bhangra or grime tracks, although each of these communities have shaped London in quite a significant way, and as a kind of, you could say, celebration of multicultural locations. So how would, for instance, the Beatles' Norwegian Wood from 1965 fit on this map? Although time and also approach-wise preceded by similar experiments like the works of guitarist Davy Graham, it nevertheless counts as one of the first fusions of Western popular music with the sitar. Sound-wise, we might describe it being somewhere between compartmentalization and syncretism. Indian sitar and Western popular music never fuse into something new, and the sitar, apparently acquired by Harrison in London, was still played without deeper understanding. Harrison would only take up lessons after the recordings. Lacking deeper transcultural interaction, it thus still reflects a predominantly Western perspective. In a way, it seems that reggae, as evident with the culture's Bolted Bridge, became one of the clearest early sound-related markers of transcultural fusion in London, later also by being adapted into punk. It is also exemplary in that the transcultural adaptation process was strongly intertwined with the music industry, also an issue that has been mentioned in many discussions, as evident with Island Records that was founded in 1959 by Chris Blackwell in Jamaica and was actually named after Harry Belafonte's island son. Blackwell relocated in London in 1962. Although not played on the radio at that time, apparently Blackwell had to advertise his recordings in the shops himself. Island Records provided the central space and thus visibility of reggae music. This transcultural space expanded to other areas, as Island Records also started to provide the alternative space for experimental fusion musics. I personally actually came across Island Records due to my research on electric folk or folk rock. Central early bands like the London-based Fairport Convention first recorded here. Island Records thus actually provided the space for English folk rock to emerge at all. Again, something that only becomes visible with this mapping perspective. If it is the other London that actually is representative of London, then the two-dimensional map of the 100 London song lists is actually the distorted map. Interesting, For example, similarly excluded are rap and grime, the electronic genre that, including jungle, dancehall, hip-hop, emerged in the 2000s in London. Due to its large variety of influences, including Jamaican elements such as reggae, it could even be described as emblematic for representing transcultural London musically. Here we find also the clearest local London associations outside the so-called white mainstream repertoire. Especially the early London rap group London Posse exemplifies how strongly London is significant for the members' identities. Yet particularly Wiley contributed to this, I would say in quotation marks, different London imagery, as evident with his song Living in London.
Basically, we're just living in London. What do you expect? We're just living in London. Basically, we're just living in London, cuz. What do you expect? We're living in London. Yo, anything you see, anything happens. Like, it doesn't matter, we're living in London. What do you expect? Where do you think we're living? Yo, Esky boy. Oh my days, where are we living? Cause when I'm rolling, no security guards, I'm living in London. Everything London. Ask anybody, any place, I work with any race, the whole plate's money. So if I'm gonna be rich, gotta be open-minded. Looking at the lights too long, get blinded. Ha, alright, you tried it. Watch when I see him on the road, I'll find him. Might see me first and catch me slipping. Not likely though, it's not likely, so I keep spitting. Drive so fast, the clock keeps ticking. This.
We will find a similar imagery in rap as illustrated by London Town, the second studio album of rapper Kano.
Yo, it's still K8 niggas, straight K niggas, spray like Cajun, you make great figures. You ain't even fucking with my mixtape niggas like Jerome Thomas with the bathing apes, like Becca with the ladies, play it till I get mine, wife and kids like Damon Wayans, K behave, nah they love me.
And yet, musicians like Wiley also illustrate the discrepancy of this London identity. While working with the London imagery and, for instance, posing in front of London skyscrapers, he actually does not live in London anymore. Yet London remains a point of orientation on these musical maps. Yet, one of the most significant popular examples of transcultural London has probably been the track Galang, meaning go along, behave yourself in Jamaican, by MIA from her first album, Arula, in 2003. And I'm just playing a short snippet here.
London calling, speak the slang now. Boys say what? Go on, girls say what? What? London calling, speak the slang now. Boys say what? Go on, girls say what? What? Slam, galang, galang, galang. Gala, 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 lang, galang, gala. Shotgun, get down. Get down, get down, get down. Get it down, get down, get down. Too late, you down. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun.
The track is also a good example of the modern referential expansion to the extent that it defies any clear mapping, hereby pointing to the complexity of the transcultural situation also tied to digital modernism. Being musically a mixture of dancehall, it is based on a reggaeton beat, electro jungle, the track also includes associations to Sri Lankan songs and world music. As a New Musical Express review pointed out, 100% ersatz, Sri Lanka imagined from a Shoreditch loft, Jamaican rhythm conjured up from a Game Boy memory card, quote end. Relating to the Clash London Calling, the text, full of media-related keywords, is about how to survive in the urban jungle that is full of drug dealing and crime. It is especially also the contrasting video that conjured a variety of associations. Unfortunately, I can't show it here, but it's really worth checking out. Not only do we see MIA cheerfully dancing, presenting a variety of fashion outfits, but also do we discover graffiti and symbols of urban Britain and Tamil, maybe freedom-fighting referenced writings. However artificial and provocative, this track actually puts a kind of transcultural digital modernism on the map that cannot be put down on one single location anymore, as for instance Warwick Avenue. This track was followed by songs such as Lily Allen's London. Co-written by Future Cat, the song with the mobile phone abbreviation of London as a title is a sarcastic portrayal of London. Sound-wise, it is a fusion of electronica and Caribbean music. Some reviews point to Colombian Poro, others to reggae ska. Again, it is the video that conveys the full multicultural contextualization and the intro. It opens with Allen in a record store called Tough Trade, which is a play on Rough Trade, a record store in London at Talbot and Portobello Road. And so I cannot really play or show you the video here, but at least you can listen to this intro.
Hi, I'm just wondering, have you got any kind of like sort of punky electronica kind of grime, kind of like new wave grime, but kind of maybe like more broken beats, like kind of dubby broken beats, but a little bit kind of soulful, like kind of drum and bassy, but kind of more broken drum and bass, like kind of broken beats, like breakbeat kind of broken drum and bass kind of, do you know what I mean? No? Hello? Oh, hi. How are you? Yeah, what, right now? Yeah, okay. Bye.
The track also illustrates the challenges of transcultural reception. Allen's transcultural map is understood within a local context. As a Guardian reviewer remarked, Lily Allen explores her dark sides with Afrobeats and Caribbean London in the song, hereby also pointing to the, and I quote here, blaring Jamaican fanfare, quote end, that becomes especially vivid in the live versions. Yet outside the English-speaking context, this symbolism is mapped differently. While the German Music Express indeed perceived the album as being close to its zeitgeist, other German reviewers described the music as Sonnenblumenunterhaltung, sunflower entertainment, sounding as if Allen is on drugs, nice brass, nice reggae ska pop song, hereby completely overlooking the text's sarcasm. So just to come to a brief outlook here. The previously discussed songs clearly exemplify the process of transculturalism in their whole global complexity, and not always with a clear outcome or understanding. This also relates to the mapping of this material, which I applied here on the first very basic level, identifying the actual reference points and thus mapping just coordinates. The practical realization will be subject, well, for the summer break. But it is through this process of making the positioning or geographies of individuals, cultures, and so on visible that referential points, especially hidden ones, and their transformations become apparent. From Lord Kitchener's London map to MIA's transcultural global referencing, we can still travel London by a song map. Yet it is also apparent that the simplest maps are sometimes the most distorted ones. Set against the ongoing debates, uncovering these distortions appears more urgent than ever. Thank you.
Hey, let's go back to that. Right. As I said, for those of you who came in after the beginning of the keynote, although there's quite a lot in there that I think may well feed into the next discussion, we are going on to something different now. Britta is going to be answering questions via the comments section. So if you go to the website and the video of this will be up there tomorrow morning, but you can comment there from now. It's the same web page, but what we're going to move on to now is the panel discussion. So if I can ask, well, Mike's already here, if I could ask Laudan and Lewis to join us, and Charisma, could I get you to switch your camera off? Thank you. Luis, are you there?
Oh yes, I'm sorry, Simon.
Yeah, okay.
My microphone was off and I was talking here for nobody.
Okay, yes, I have done that several times over the past few weeks. Yeah, both without cameras and without microphones. Okay, so we're moving on to this discussion about the value of diversity in the curriculum, and quite a lot of those issues about transculturalism are interesting in relation to this. But the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to sort of throw three topicy kind of almost questions, but mostly sort of topics into the ring, and ask Mike Loudon and Luis to respond to them. They have had some prior notice, but not much of what the questions will be. So, but also feel free to chuck in comments and questions in the chat from anyone else. And if you'd like to, ask a question face to face, maybe stick it in or stick a note in the chat saying you want to, and we can bring you in. So the first thing that I wanted to sort of throw out there was the question of whether we need a canon at all. Given that we all agree, or well, I'm assuming kind of that we all agree, that the repertoire used in teaching needs to be more diverse and representative. What do we think about the idea of a canon, and should we aim to reflect the musical tastes of our student demographic, or should we be deciding that there are certain things that they should know, and how do we set that balance? I don't know who wants to jump in as with that.
Well, I'll start. I think there are certain things that they should know or should at least become broadly aware of. But I also think that we need to consider what we are conveying when we talk about diversity and inclusion, because the words are frequently used, but the intent behind them is often quite different. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on delivery of course subject matter and creation of curriculum. Because, of course, there's a big difference between presence, a physical presence, or a theoretical ideological presence, and active participation. So diversity and inclusion, I think, need to be more clearly defined for, in specific contexts. It's my 2 cents.
Good. I would like to talk about a little bit about the canon. So the question, first of all, it's pretty good to be here. I'm so glad to see all of you. Even I am seeing just some names on my screen, but it's a great pleasure. Thanks, Simon, for this invitation. Thanks, Marta, for set up this kind of meeting between me and Simon, and it's a great pleasure to meet all of you. So the question, Simon sent us a lot of questions, and I asked him before how many days we have to try to answer these questions, but we have just something like 1 hour. And so the first question is about canon, and the first topics. Do we need a canon? I think that in some sense, as human beings, yes. I don't know if we need a canon, but even when we are trying to be anti-canonic in some sense, we are always creating some other types of canons. I'd like to mention, for example, the reality of Brazilian popular music in higher education these days, or specific programs in Brazilian popular music undergraduate programs. And in general, although we changed the type of music that we teach, the types of music, we are trying to incorporate a diversity of different types of Brazilian popular music. We always elected a kind of canon to teach. In Brazil, it implies teach samba, choro, sometimes of umbrella genre that we call Brazilian popular music, but in some sense, it is a kind of exclusive concept. It's not exactly a genre, but a set of genres that we valorize in Brazilian popular music. And from this point of view, I could mention the American jazz. We have a lot of Latin America influence in American music these days, but in general, they are not included in undergraduate programs and things like that. And so I think that the question is, in fact, I believe that the main point, if we are aware of that, if you are aware that we create canons, we have to reassess our music programs and our music teaching continuously, pushing ourselves to diversity by defining some canons that we've been following. So it implies the problem in Brazilian higher education these days, it is because we are still so hold on to traditional canons of Western classical music. So we are trying to incorporate other types of canons by taking into account Brazilian popular music. And right now, in these types of specific programs, Brazilian popular music programs, we are trying to incorporate other types of music that are not exactly the canons of Brazilian popular music. I think that the problem is not we have some canons, but when these canons are completely limited, especially just encompassing some types of repertoires and some types of music.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So I think I broadly agree with both Mike and Louise. I think my inclination has always been anti-canonical, but as Louise pointed out, even when you're anti-canonical, you're acting against a canon. I think that as that question, I think can add knowledge base among a musical community. I mean, I think we need some kind of shared knowledge as a starting point. The challenge, I think, is how we use those canons, how those canons become spaces or scaffoldings for positions of power, which is what has happened. So I think that's a really difficult challenge, is how you, because ultimately the question is what is in that canon and what is outside, and that becomes a question related to questions of power. So yeah, that's my response. I think I think we probably do need canons of some kind, but it's how we manage those. The other question about reflecting students' musical tastes and whether that canon should reflect musical tastes. I mean, that's a complex question because, of course, our students may have very diverse and eclectic musical tastes. But I think as an educator, my role is very much about opening horizons and exposing students to things that they may not have experienced. So I would say not necessarily. That our role is not necessarily to reflect the musical tastes, but yeah, I don't know what the end of that sentence is. I think students need to be able to identify with the things that we're teaching them, but we need to also stretch them and take them beyond that. Yeah, that's me.
Mike, can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit on, you talked about the difference between presence and participation. I mean, I can get a sense of that, but have you got any sort of specific thoughts about what it means for people in mind? Something a bit.
Well, I suppose one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of curriculum and delivery of material is And the fact...
Sorry, you broke up. Oh, you
broke up.
You've frozen again. Could you? Yeah. I don't know if that happened for everybody, but it happened for me.
Can you hear me clearly at the moment? Okay. All right. Yes. One of the things I was thinking about was my role as a foreign black male professor in the American South during the Trump administration, and sometime before that during the Bush administration. All of these things affect the reception of the delivery of the material. I mean, consider, I may be straying from the scope of the question that you've asked, but ultimately it's going to come back to the core of it. Consider the situation wherein I'm going into a history of the recording industry class at this point. And I'm talking about blackface. That's going to be the first topic in the course. What I'm getting at is that my students' reception is going to be very different from those of my white colleagues, partly because of the overall cultural and political environment, but also because of the medium, of delivery. So when we talk about, coming back to your specific question now, the issue of the difference between physical presence and active participation, even discussing the issue of blackface may be perceived as revolutionary or counter-establishment, even though it's just a standard part of the course. So what I'm suggesting is that the physical presence doesn't operate outside of the cultural and political circumstances that frame the delivery of the material.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot more sense. It felt a little diffuse before, but that's very specific and very, very clear. Yeah. Any responses from that from the others, or other points that you'd like to make?
I do just to students, and I think that I totally agree in some sense, and I believe that it's really important to incorporate musical tastes and musical interests of our students, but also it's really important to give them the opportunity to explore and know a large set of local and music making. I think that when we incorporate other types of activities beyond that tastes, we are incorporate discussion about diversity in a diversified sense. I mean, we are talking about music linked to anti-racism. We are talking about, and for example, in Brazil, used in local indigenous community. And so we create this kind of atmosphere to understand and to interact with diversity beyond the spherical and sonorous aspects. I mean, and I think that it is what Mike would like to say when he's talking about this interactivity. You are learning more than just rhythm, melodies, harmonies, and things like that. So when we are just working on musical tastes of our students, we have a problem because in some sense we are keeping them hold on to the values that they already have. And it is more than musical or at least spherical aspects. I think that they should be included in a large debate about, for example, in Brazil. I'd like to mention that if Mike has Trump in the United States, I have Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's very similar. And we restart in Brazil to have problems with racism, chauvinism, a lot of problems with indigenous communities, because our government is stimulating this kind of issues, social issues. And I think that music diversity and a curriculum based on diversity is really important to get over this type of problems beyond the experience to play and to understand a large set of musical possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I wanted to come back to the sort of third, in the third question, to the idea of how ideology or polemics feed into what we do as educators, because I mean, in some ways, what we're saying here is, you know, by saying we are anti-canonical, but there is a direction of diversity that we want to go in. It's obviously an ideological statement, and that we're counteracting a previous ideological statement that was about a narrower form of canon. So, well, maybe seeing as nobody in the audience at the moment is putting direct questions in, maybe if we go on to the second one, then we can come back afterwards. But so where I was going to go next was this idea of, should we be trusting students to generate their own repertoire? So because another thing that I mentioned in the email that I sent you was the idea that we're talking about this in quite general terms, but there are a lot of different courses that students are going on, and different courses have different uses for repertoire and different reasons for including it, and some of those reasons may be about technical know-how, about doing something better against a set of criteria, or it may be if they're learning about historical musicology, should they be creating their own stylistic timelines, and with analysis, should they be damn, I just lost my notes, there it is, should they be finding their own particular examples to relate to particular ideas or concepts that we're wanting them to understand? So I mean, the two examples I put in the question were find their own examples of epistemic violence or oppression, or particular rhyming structures in songs, depending on how, you know, we could go any kind of direction with that. But the question, I suppose, is should we be encouraging students to develop their canon, or perhaps a little less polemically, their own repertoire lists?
Who wants to go first? I can go first.
Go on,
I mean, yes, I would say yes, absolutely. I think that obviously it goes without saying that we are encouraging students to develop their own critical faculties, which also means generating their own repertoire lists. But I think we equip them with the skills to know what they're doing. We should be equipping them with the skills. So if they're developing their own kind of, I don't know if canonic is the right word here. I mean, that it's perhaps we need some other kind of terminology. But so, for example, if we're talking about classical performers, encouraging them, thinking about diversity, for example. So, for example, I know some institutions have done this. We've instituted prizes for the best performance of a work by a female composer in final recitals, for example, to encourage students to explore. Sorry, that wasn't a good example for this particular conference, but it's the one that just came to mind. But you could find similar examples. So as a way of encouraging them to diversify their own canons, if you like. So I think the answer to your question of whether we should, yes, absolutely, with guidance and with the skills that we're hopefully developing in them. That would be my response.
Yeah, I guess whether we should is a bit of a stupid question, really. It's more of a how would you do that in a way that makes sense, and you've kind of gone there with that, which is.
So I'm not sure what the example would, because we don't teach popular music performance. So maybe others have got better examples of how that might work in terms of a broader diversity of repertoire.
Well, whenever anyone mentions canons, of course, my mind always goes to the physical canon with its different spelling and the whole metaphor of ignition, which I think is what we as educators are intended to provide with varying degrees of explosive. But ultimately, for example, and this may not be the best example, but when I think about discussing reggae music in class, how can we possibly deal with that without providing some kind of post-colonial historical framework? We have to bring something to the table that facilitates and enables perception, comprehension, and analysis of that material within a very specific and relevant context. Now, that can be a point of departure for the students, but we still have to create some sort of foundation, some starting point that's tangible and relevant.
That's it. I think that it's a wonderful point, Mike. I do believe that we have to decide things together by exploring different options and alternatives. It implies we shouldn't decide all things for students, but set up some experience to research, to experience, to emerge in a diversified set of repertoire and experience. And it includes, in some sense, you bring some foundations, some questions to be discussed, some repertoires to be explored in a large sense. And I think that research in a large sense is a great strategy because you promote more than musical experience. In fact, you promote this kind of interest in discovering about Brazilian popular music history, and we're going to identify that it was really colonized in the past, and we still have these traits of coloniality. We discovered that we teach Western classical music and just it in a lot of great universities in Brazil because of this process of colonization. It was a way to civilize the society. So they have another way to interact, for example, with classical musical repertoires when they have this kind of knowledge, and they have another way to interact with Brazilian popular music when they realize that it is part of an amazing process of coloniality, epistemics, and exclusions. It implies that, for example, we have Black students in our program here at the university, and we have a large program of music, different types of programs. And some Black students are saying right now, after a research that we conducted in Afro-Brazilian music, that they had no idea that for a long time, this type of music was completely excluded from the universities. And so right now they are playing this type of music and they are acting like activists to promote interaction, to valorize, to talk about this type of music. And the first question that when we started to work on this research was something like, what do you know about Black Brazilian composers? and they discovered that they didn't have any kind of knowledge about it. From this point of view, from this first question, they started to ask themselves, who are the Black Brazilian composers that we should study a little bit more? What kind of composition they composed specifically? What kind of Black influence, what kind of African, Afro-Brazilian influence this type of music has, and things like that. So I think that is always this process of interaction, because on their own, they wouldn't decide to study this type of repertoire initially, because they didn't have this kind of question. It wasn't a problem from their point of view, because in general, we don't study this kind of thing in schools of music, traditional schools of music, and even in our history, when we study in elementary school, high school, in general, we don't talk about this type of programs. It is improving a lot over this last 20 years, but it is something that we still have to explore, for example, in Brazil, in Latin America, in general, in South America, and everywhere, I think.
Yeah, and that sort of problem of invisibility of things that you don't know about, and that's where we can come in to some extent. But that sort of problem of invisibility is interesting, because it also reflects. I'm just thinking about the way this relates to some of the comments that have been made in the chat about encouraging people in particular directions and being a kind of guide rather than rather than just providing materials, being a guide to in a search process. But knowing what is invisible to them is an important part of being an educator, and being able to point people in the right direction. But it's also, it sort of exposes our own limitations, in that I mean, since I started teaching in 1998, around then, I've relied more or less exclusively on my students to introduce me to new forms of music, rather than me being able to follow culture on a kind of grassroots level, because I'm just old and not able to do it, basically. What's also interesting about that is that they need to feel themselves as visible contributors to my education, as well as vice versa. I was talking to my wife last night about how we were going to have this discussion, and we were talking about, she's a visual artist, so we were talking about repertoire in the visual arts as well as this, and we had a long discussion, and she did point out that she was going to be the invisible party in this process, that you know, I'm going to be saying a lot of things that are actually a sort of co-production, if you like. So just citing my wife as a influential source in this, whatever I've said, basically. But yeah, I mean, that that idea of visibility and citation, and how that provides value to both in terms of what the students feel about their contribution, but also it goes back to what you were saying, Mike, about the difference between presence and participation, that that it's about becoming part of the process, I suppose.
Could I say something, Simon? Sorry. So I think there's also, as well as questions of canon in relation to repertoire, there's another aspect of canon which I don't know if we're also referring to, which are things like scholarly sources, for example. So Britta referred to the work of Wolfgang Welsh, which I hadn't come across before, and I think particularly for those of us in English language speaking countries, there's also issues of canon in relation to the literature that we're giving our students to read as well, I think, which we need to think about. Obviously, partly because of language barriers, that's a problem. The other thing I was going to say was I absolutely agree with you that we should be co-producing knowledge with our students. I think the increasing neoliberalization of higher education, as I've seen it in the UK, increasingly makes that more difficult because students come in paying a lot of money to buy effectively what is kind of a product, and they want us to fill them with knowledge. And it's a very different way of thinking about what education is about, actually. So the transactional nature of it, I think, impacts on how they expect us to be teaching them.
Yeah, the transactional nature and the idea of themselves as a vessel and knowledge as a thing that gets poured into them. That's a really important metaphor. And what a couple of people have mentioned what Hetty said earlier on. Hetty said, isn't it more appropriate to focus on methods, skills that we teach rather than on content of repertoire? That does relate very specifically to the last question that I wanted to pose, but I suppose we could go there and then we can just start getting messy after that because we've got a fair amount of time left. And that for me is the question of how does our choice of, and again this relates to what you've just said, Loudon, about literature, because it's about theoretical models and tools of analysis that we may or may not have access to because of the canon of literature that we do connect with, and yes, language is one thing, but also disciplinarity is another. It's been because I kind of don't fit into a nice neat category as far as subject area. I did my PhD in electroacoustic composition, and then went into sort of science and technology studies, and also got interested in ecological approaches to perception. So I've got this kind of weird combination of disciplines, all of which say very similar things about stuff, but with different language and with different nuances to it. So a lot of the stuff about embodied cognition and the idea of the idea of embodied cognition relates very strongly to affect theory, that is kind of more of a musicology thing, and also very strongly to Dennis Smalley's spectromorphology, which is a sort of electroacoustic language of electroacoustic music thing. And those three areas of discipline are sets of tools, analytical tools that the structure of them, the nature of them, creates different sets of questions, allows you to ask questions in different ways. I've got off the wording that I was using before, but so I was saying, how much does the choice of analytical tools determine or reflect the repertoire and the ideologies that inform that repertoire, but also the whole subject area about methodology. So choosing to do a Schenkerian analysis of harmonic forms is based on a very different ideology of what is important than an analysis of microtiming or groove. And likewise, something like a kind of feminist user-focused theory from technology studies, like I can't remember anyone's name suddenly because I've put myself on the spot, so I'm going to move away from that rather rapidly. That reflects a different ideology than, say, a post-colonial approach about epistemic violence, Foucault, and the tools. Going back to sort of Hetty's question, the tools therefore are also an ideology that structures the way we think in the same way that the repertoire does, I suppose. So again, I've just asked the question, how much does it, which is a really stupid way of phrasing the question, because I was writing in a hurry. But anything you'd like to say about this topic rather than answering that question would be good.
Well, I suppose whatever we're doing, we're going to be joined in some way, connected in some way to our ideological backgrounds and biases. And we have to be conscious of those and try to find ways to expand our own ideological boundaries in ways that invite the students to do the same. But certainly where popular music is concerned, again, the post-colonial issue becomes very important as, from my perspective, conveying another way among many, many possible ways of perceiving the music, its purpose, its direction, its origins, and influences. So when we're talking about analytical tools, I think we should probably be encouraged to use those that come most easily to us, while also making some reference to many which are a little less familiar.
Good point. So I would say that we have a lot of problems to set up our curricula or different types of curricula these days, because we have different types of programs. And in general, we had in the past some common courses like ear training, music theory, and things like that. As we increased a lot the set of repertoires and types of music that we've been working on these days, we have something like 7 different types of undergraduate programs, and all of them work on different types of concepts and types of music and perspectives of performers, analysis, and things like that. I think that the main problem that we've been facing right now, it is because we discovered that the traditional way to work on ear training is not enough to work on ear training that we need linked to Brazilian popular music, for example, or to work in kinds of traditional, Brazilian traditional music that follow other types of perspectives. Although you have a type of perception that you need to develop, to have theories, they are completely different. So I think that the answer is yes, the repertoire is it's the base of this historical, theoretical, analytical knowledge that we've been worked on for a long time. And for this reason, maybe we should have different types of proposals, different type of curricula to incorporate other theories, other analytical tools, other ear training classes. We are using other types of names to define this set of classes. And I think that we've been working these days on other types of questions. For example, we incorporated a lot of repertoires, a lot of different types of music, but we are using the same discipline and course-based curriculum. It is a big deal, because if we would like to teach Afro-Brazilian music, we should incorporate that off-campus activities are part of this process, and more important, to work engaged than, in fact, classes into the campus. And so our new music popular program, you have something like 30% of the workload is off campus. And we are trying to interact the students with the performances, the composition process. They are trying to play other types of instruments, not exactly the main one that they are studying. If you are a guitarist, but you'd like to play Afro-Brazilian music from Bahia, you should play different types of drums, because it is the way that you have to understand the rhythmic structure and things like that. So, and in the future, our plan is something like 20% of the program into the campus and 80% off, because we learn music, or at least these different types of music, connecting with them, engaging, in fact, in these practices. And it implies, in fact, other tools, other theories, other histories, other perspectives to teach and learn. And it is something that we've been working on in Brazil, because we discovered that for a long time, if you change the repertoire, but you keep the same curricular model, you have a lot of problems, in fact, to teach this different music. And the tendency is like, you're gonna teach another song, you're gonna teach another piece by using the same way that you used for a long time to teach Western classical repertoire. And it's not possible you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, the model of teaching Western classical repertoire could do with having that same kind of approach in terms of a kind of situated learning approach, rather than the sort of isolated conservatoire. I think it's one of its problems at the moment. But yeah, so Loudon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have a great deal to add to what's been said. I mean, I think obviously it goes without saying that the analytical approaches that we employ inevitably reflect the canonical traditions of our particular areas of training and disciplines. So we bring those with us. And, you know, scholarship is obviously not ideologically free. We know that. And the same goes for our analytical techniques. So that they're very deeply implicated ideologically, I think, and thinking about the discussion, what Luis was just saying about, it made me think about the ways in which, you know, all the discussions around curricular diversity. For me, one of the big central problems, so I'm going a bit off track here, but I think it relates to some of the earlier points. One of the big problems is, you know, we have a university curriculum in the UK by and large, which started off focused on Western art music and has diversified kind of in a rather piecemeal way. So things kind of, you tinker at the edges and you add things on. And we've never really, I don't know, I can't speak for every music department, every institution, but certainly that's been my experience by and large. Whereas probably what we need is a kind of rethink of the whole thing, building up from the ground, from scratch. That doesn't have Western art music as the kind of normative starting point as it is for many degrees, with a bit of world music and popular music thrown in. I know that may not apply for every single course, but it kind of characterizes quite a lot of what's happened in the UK, I think. Sorry, that wasn't an answer to your question, but it's a broader anxiety, I guess, about the whole diversity discourse, which doesn't really address the underlying systemic problems with our curriculum.
No, I agree, and I think I mean, I think what's interesting is, and maybe this is true of the kind of newer music departments in the States as well, Mike, that that with the sort of post-92 universities in the UK and places like MTSU and Massachusetts Lowell that have developed recording arts and music industry and creative production and performance, where they haven't had a classical tradition necessarily behind them, or at least where those departments have been kind of superseded by others, that generally there isn't the time or the space to do what you've just suggested, Loudon, which would be a great thing to do, to actually sit and have a big discussion about what would be a good way to do that.
I mean, it is time and space, but there's also a lot of we would find a lot of resistance from certain quarters to doing that, because a lot of people are very happy with the status quo.
Yeah, no, indeed, and I mean, West London sort of sits in between two worlds in that it's the older London College of Music Conservatoire thing, but that's become much smaller, and the other departments have grown in contrast to it. So there is space for change, and we've been making a lot of change, but it's just not the time and the kind of there isn't the kind of mental energy in the sector, I think, to say, well, we've got to reinvent ourselves, let's do it. But I think in a lot of ways that is partly what we're talking about here, because it's not going to happen without a kind of major reshuffle. Otherwise, we are tinkering on the edges. There was something I was going to say that slipped my mind.
There are some good questions in the chat. Hetty's asking whether there are lessons we can learn from Brazil, given that there's been so much innovation there.
Lewis, what do you think about lessons that we can learn from Brazil?
Great. I am trying to read here. Just a second. So I would say that we have tried to incorporate some new perspectives about curricula in plural, in fact, because we've been working on perspectives that points out something like it's not possible we have a kind of model that for a long time was the reality in Brazil. Like every single university around the country in different regions, for example, some pretty close to the Amazon, was teaching by using the same curriculum model than we had in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, southern Brazil, and things like that. I think these days we are trying to incorporate different perspectives to set up the curriculum and to include other types of repertoire. And especially, I would say that we have some new proposals in the Northeast regarding these perspectives to teach, creating strategies to interact our students to the context that they are studying. I mean, for example, Marta, who is attending our meeting here, has written a lot of papers about different Brazilian popular music genres. But for example, we have a lot of amazing genres in the Northeast, and we have never studied them. It implies, and I have read before a question on the chat, someone asked about research. I think that research is the secret because, for example, we have frevo. It is a kind of Brazilian genre so popular in Recife, in Northeast, pretty popular because of the carnival and things like that in the Northeast. But we don't have music history that includes, in fact, frevo. And so what we have been working on here in Paraíba, for example, is try to engage our students in research, first of all, and write this kind of histories. And we have different types of perspectives to work on different types of music. So I think that research is a great strategy to know something that we don't know, we still don't know, and to create some other strategies to teach by incorporating not only the spherical aspect of this type of music, but ways that they use to teach, ways that they use to perform these repertoires locally in their own communities and things like that. I would say that we have some new proposals in Northeast. We can change some ideas. Who is interested in, I can share my email. And we've been trying to make things different in Brazil because of our needs. We faced for a long time problems. I don't know if everywhere knows, but in Brazil, public education is completely free in higher education. It implies if someone gets a spot in a public university, they don't have to pay any kind of fee, tuition, or things like that. For this reason, these days, the society as a whole is expecting to the university a kind of commitment to be more close and to work more engaged on social issues and things like that. And I think that it has created some kinds of, at least, sources for us to change curriculum, to propose something new. I think that research is a great strategy in a large sense. I'm not talking exactly about methods or a systematic training in research, but research as something to discover and to build different types of knowledge that in the case of Brazil, it's not written in books or things like that. If we do like, for example, to study local music, we will not find books or at least a lot of books written about it. We have to write this history. And first of all, we have to research. And we are using our curricula, our classes, our courses to set up this kind of knowledge. And I think that more than the outcomes, and it's good to have these outcomes because we are writing a lot of papers about Brazilian music. This process has been so interesting for our students because they are experiencing a lot of different types of musical repertoires off campus in the context, learning how people play, but how they dance, how they interact with each other, how they eat as a social interaction, and it makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, that's reminded me of a set of performance grades that London College of Music exams developed, not sure how long ago now, but a while back. And the idea was to have a kind of tradition neutral form of grades that allowed people to bring their own repertoire and set the criteria for what constituted a good performance in whatever tradition they brought. So the idea was to allow, rather than part of the issue was that within the African countries that LCM was doing these exam grades in, it was a very important part of musical education to have the piece of paper, to have the, you know, the grade certificate. And what it meant was that people who had access to classical or jazz education could do that much more easily than anyone else, because nobody designs grade systems for I don't know, West African drumming, you know, these the idea was to try and, rather than to try and write sets of grades for every tradition, was to try and create a set of grades that would allow an ensemble to come in and perform. And what was interesting was the question of whether someone from outside of that tradition, who was an LCM examiner who had skills in elsewhere, would be able to assess them or not. That was a kind of really problematic thing. And in the end, they did some experiments with, you know, people who were experts and people who were experts in a different tradition, and generally they gave the same, more or less the same grades to ensembles, because they could identify excellence or they could identify skill, and that skill isn't that different. Once you see someone is consistently doing a particularly odd intonation thing, but they're doing it consistently, you realize, okay, that must be part of their tradition. You've got to be relatively open-minded about it, but it becomes part of the process. And that seems to me to be something that is potential, a potential way of sorry, my dog's sneezing. Is a potential way of creating more equality through a diversity, but just in terms of qualifications. That's quite a it is quite an important aspect. Those of us who have access to qualifications kind of forget about the problem of actual access to the different types of paperwork. Any other thoughts on that?
Hey, Simon, I just would like to mention that because of the coronavirus pandemic, I think that people, especially musicians and music professors, are realizing that we have a lot of things to change in our undergraduate and graduate programs, because right now everyone is trying to incorporate some new technologies, is trying to learn new strategies to teach music performance by using digital platforms. A lot of things like that linked to diversity that we are talking about in some sense, that in the past was considered like a debate not so important to the field of music. It's something like has no way to teach someone to be a great performer. We have to be it one-on-one class by using traditional ways to teach. And right now, all of these professors are pretty open to incorporate some new strategies, to read the strategies, to set up curricula differently. And I think that we have a great motivation to change, because people are willing to do different, at least because they realized that the way that we've been teaching for a long time is not enough to attend this new world.
Yeah, and I think that relates a bit to Karishma's point about access, about the prohibitive cost of UK music education, and that given that Cambridge have put all of their courses online for the next year, that makes you kind of consider, well, what does that say about access to education from in a transcultural sense? So going back to Britta's transculturalism in terms of processes as well as repertoire, that transcultural processes of communication, as you say, this kind of we've all been thrown into new modes of communication that are exposing the fact that we can open up our education system in a different way. Obviously not in an entirely online sense, but that there are techniques that we can use. And I think the other thing that's been interesting for me is partly to do with what's happened with this conference, but also with a few other little initiatives that have been happening, is the idea of universities sorry, sneezing dog, is the idea of universities collaborating much more in terms of actual teaching, not just in terms of research activities, but actually of delivering content in, swapping lectures, providing mutual content that people can get access to. I think that's an interesting thing that's thanks Juan Pablo, I shall tell him later. Yeah, has anybody got any questions on has anybody got any questions well, for any of us about the topic, because we're getting close to 8 o'clock now, and or have any of the panelists got any things that they want to add?
Well, I noticed there was an interesting comment in the chat regarding introducing visual aesthetics and things like sociocultural elements. And I think that's going to be an important, well, it's important now, but it's going to become even more important in the future, especially as we have to use various technological media to deliver the material and convey thoughts about it. Also, for a place like MTSU, with its Department of Recording Industry, for those on the audio production side, the technology creates a new kind of barrier if your education is supposed to be premised on a hands-on experience and a more direct, tactile familiarity and relationship with equipment, and an experiential background, engagement with that equipment. So those are just two other points there.
Yeah, and Hetty's, oh, Loudon, you've just, yeah, mentioned exactly the same thing. Yeah, that the point of the processes being used to actually undercut academic pay and jobs and all of the above, basically. Yeah, I mean, it is a very double-edged sword what's happening at the moment, because certainly I can, you can kind of see bean counters rubbing their hands together in universities as they see partly what's happening, and thinking of ways, rather than thinking of ways of making the experience better, it's about making the experience cheaper. Cheaper to deliver anyway, not necessarily to pay for. We seem to have lost Lewis. Oh, he's just switched his camera off.
Yes, I had a connection problem. Sorry about
okay. Yeah. Any sort of final points? Yeah. No. In IP. Yes. Exactly. Loudon. IP is a very interesting point that I think at our place the university's been asked. The union has been asked to kind of look into that question a little bit, but yeah. So okay, any last thoughts from people before we listen to some music?
Well, just perhaps the idea that I was just returning to another strand of thought from a little earlier, but it's just the idea that when we talk about or consider transforming curriculum, we need to be very consciously aware of the cultural variety or lack thereof in our student base, and also the ways in which they perceive, as Loudon referred to, the transactional nature of education. These things have a direct impact on what we are able to offer and the kind of transformation that we can bring about in terms of curriculum.
Nice. I just would like to mention that I think that diversity is part of the world. I mean, the real musical life is diversified, is diverse. And so I believe that include diversity into our curricula as a whole is not an option these days. And it is something vital to make our musical programs relevant, to make our programs connect with the words, connect better with the times and things like that. I think that it is what we discovered in Brazil. It's like for a long time, we had like the musical world outside the university and a kind of institutional world that just existed into the universities. And we were suffering a lot to keep this structure working well. And these days, I believe that we have this perception to keep the canons, if we would like to do that in some sense, we have to incorporate diversity as part of the curricula because the society is completely diverse, the musical life is diverse, and the university, the music programs, the curricula have to be as well. I think that it is the perspective that we have in Brazil, and for this reason, we've been trying to change things a lot as a way to survive. And I think that this perspective is much important for Latin American countries, but I believe that for the entire world.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I'm just reading Juan Pablo's comment. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose I don't know why I'm having closing remarks, but because I'm meant to be just asking questions, but I'm going to have some anyway. I mean, I think, you know, we've all kind of said not so much that we want there to be a canon as such, but that our job is to guide people to explore a wider variety of materials that becomes canon-like in some way, because that's the way of the world. That's the way, you know, we can only have a certain number of things happening at once, and we can only, you know, there's only so much room in the curriculum. I think that idea that all of us have kind of talked about in a lot of ways is about encouraging students to look at the history of what they're into, and also look at, you know, point out connections to what they're into places that might be invisible to them at the moment for whatever reasons, and that seems to be a kind of good point to end on. Loudon's had to leave, but yeah, it was very interesting. So the next thing I'm going to do is play the concert from Sandra Vesely. So I hope you'll sort of hang around, and maybe we can chat in the chat section to you know, with just to keep the conversation going on for a little while whilst the music continues. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and start the video concert, if I can find it. Here we go, and there we are with
giorno. Sospeso per lo stupore di 1000 occhi chiassosi, senza fondo e privi di espressione. Hello everybody, I am Sandra Veseli. I'm a singer, bass player, songwriter from Milan. I wanted to say thank you for featuring my music on the IASPM conference. I'm very happy that you'll be able to hear me. And what you'll hear is a few of my songs, a couple of which are going to be on my EP that is going to be out this fall. So if you want to stay up to date on any news, just follow me on Instagram and Facebook, YouTube, whatever. And this next song is called Big Boy. There he comes, fat and bored. What he has, no, I don't know. A bad is a bad, a hole is a hole, a rat is a rat, a hole is a hole. In the sweetest sport I did not tell. Once he got me something to drink, and he put something in it, and I got tears in my eyes, and I got blood in my nose, and you left me with some kind of fear of being alone. Big bulging eyes, big back and big bones, big feet and big toes. He's a big boy. Big bulging eyes, big white teeth in his mouth, and big hands to knock me down. In the corridor at the second floor, knock, 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 knock at the door. A bed is a bed, a whore is a whore. A bed is a bed, and a whore is a whore. And the scene is set, the police won't come, And love is just love, it's no sin. 'Cause the wires of the phone will not ring. And I got tears in my eyes, and I got blood in my nose. And you left me with some kind of fear of walking alone. Big bulging eyes, big back and big bones, big feet and big toes. Here's a big boy. Big bulging eyes, big white teeth in his mouth, and big hands to knock me down, to knock me down. Thank you for listening, if you're still there. The next two songs are based on poems by a English, French, Egyptian poet named, whose name was Joyce Mansour. And she was close to the Surrealist movement, and she wrote both in English and in French. If you're interested in poetry and if you don't know her, I suggest you to go check her out because I really love her work. This song is called Sneeze. Three-brained being with strange soft hands walks swiftly through the drifting day. A three-brained being with strange soft hands walks swiftly through the drifting bay. Of boundless abortion. The rusty husk of inanimate things, burning informal like an unkind reminder, snivels through shrieks, snivels through shrieks. Should say I, for I will not be a victim. No, no. Tribal from its socket. Wrinkle your face with tired fingers and suck your tongue dry. Wrench each eyeball from its socket. Wrinkle your face with tired fingers and suck your tongue dry. Suck your tongue dry, and suck your tongue dry. La nuit, le ciel est en saxe vert. Le feu s'assoupit, l'oisive se meurt. Le corps perd ses forces bien avant minuit. Désirant se voir mort, il meurt déjà. Le temps n'est plus qu'un caveau funèbre pour celui qui allait dans la superstition. Les cadavres se souviennent de la mort longtemps après les 40 jours d'usage. La poussière n'étouffe que le déjà oublié. Les morts respirent. Ah, le regard troué, la bouche attirée par le jeu électrique de l'immense bâillement, de l'éternuement final par l'aspiration et le sanglot par le hoquet, le dernier. Oh, ah, ah, ah. Oh, ah, ah, ah. Ficelé, le feu, fils de bois, le vent, fils de vie. Même les forêts peuvent espérer le brûlot. Y a-t-il douleur plus amoureuse de son aiguillon que la mienne, que la mienne, que la mienne? So this next song is going to be my last one. And I wanted to thank again all the IASPM staff for having me. If you enjoyed my music, please consider making a small donation to support me, and follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And this last song is called Panopticon, and it was released as a single in May, so if you want to, you can check it out also on Spotify and YouTube. And it's a song about surveillance.
But who's got time? Who's got the time? Thank you again. My microphone kept falling all the time.
I made it anyway. So thank you again for listening and for watching, and ciao. Until next time.
Right. Thanks everybody for sticking around, and oh, let me just stop the